Welcome to the B-Side Bible, the podcast where we look past the official track list of religious history and dissect the raw, unpolished demo tapes of the ancient world. When we read ancient scripture today, we are looking at a highly finished product, texts that have been curated, translated, and polished by centuries of tradition. But if you know how to read between the lines, you can still hear the echoes of the original arguments. This show is an objective, historical post-mortem of ancient literature. We examine the forgotten texts, the political smear campaigns, the cross-cultural pollination, and the fierce editorial battles that shaped the spiritual landscape of the Mediterranean and Near East, long before these ideas became standard doctrine. The B-Side Bible is anchored in a simple premise, that the scribes of antiquity were not writing passive, timeless devotionals. They were media-savvy survivalists, master propagandists, and sharp political operators writing for an audience that knew exactly how the game was played. If you want to pull back the curtain on how these ancient ideas were actually engineered, you can find more episodes along with my novels, other podcasts, and YouTube channel at naranimatestudios.com.au. Today, we are taking an analytical look at the mechanics of ancient literary shorthand, specifically a single recurring number that acts as a major structural hinge across both the Old and New Testaments. In the modern West, we treat numbers like digital stopwatches or accountant's ledgers. We want to know the exact metrics. But to a first century or ancient Near East reader, numbers carried an entirely different weight. We are tracking a specific mathematical symbol that appears every single time a universe is unmade, a code of law is passed down, or a first-century messianic movement launches a public relations war. It is an exploration that moves from the universal biological realities of human gestation through the psychological trauma of the Babylonian exile and straight into a high-stakes theological showdown under the iron heel of the Roman Empire. We aren't here to preach. We aren't here to moralise. We are here to look at how a single number was weaponised by ancient writers to completely shape the identity of a nation. Let's look at the B-side of the number 40. If you open up the pages of biblical literature, you will start to notice a pattern, a recurring rhythm. It almost feels like a literary heartbeat, pulsing just beneath the surface of the text. It doesn't matter if you are reading the ancient mythological prose of Genesis, the legalistic codes of Exodus, the gritty historical narrative of Kings, or the dramatic first-century biographies of the Gospels. A specific number keeps appearing over and over again at the exact hinges of history. When the primeval world is swallowed by the chaotic waters of the deep in the book of Genesis, the rain falls for 40 days and 40 nights. When Moses ascends the lightning-split peaks at Mount Sinai to receive the stone tablets of the law, he vanishes into the thick cloud of the divine presence for exactly 40 days and 40 nights, eating no bread and drinking no water. When the Israelite refugees escape the iron fist of Egyptian slavery, they do not take the direct coastal highway to the land of Canaan. Instead, they spend 40 years wandering the harsh, rocky terrain of the Sinai Peninsula. Centuries later, when the prophet Elijah is running for his life from an angry queen, he eats a meal provided by an angel and travels on the strength of that food for 40 days and 40 nights until he reaches that very same mountain of God. And then, when you cross over the threshold into the New Testament, the rhythm continues. Immediately after a young rabbi named Jesus of Nazareth is baptized in the River Jordan, the text tells us that the Holy Spirit drives him straight out into the barren Judean desert. For how long? 40 days, where he is tempted by the devil. And after his death and reported resurrection, how long does he spend teaching his disciples before finally ascending into heaven? According to the book of Acts, it is 40 days. If you look at this recurring number through a modern Western lens, it feels deeply confusing. If you are reading the text with a strictly modern form of literalism, it feels like the divine has a very specific, almost obsessive setting on a digital stopwatch. We tend to look at numbers in the 21st century as statistics, hard, cold data points meant to tell us exactly how long something took or precisely how many items were in a room. We want to know the exact metrics. We approach the text with the mind of an accountant or a physicist. But on the B side of history, we have to look past our modern biases. Because to the ancient Near Eastern scribes, who actually sat down to write, edit, compile, and preserve these scriptures, the number 40 was not a maths problem. It was not an insurance claim. It was a code. And if we step out of our comfortable mindsets and put ourselves in the dusty sandals of the people who first heard these stories told around campfires and in ancient temple courts, it was a theological idiom, a flashing neon sign that told the listener, pay attention, because what is happening right now is not normal history. This is a period of radical testing, deep identity transition, and spiritual incubation. Now, when modern people discover that a number in an ancient text is symbolic, there is a dangerous tendency to dismiss it. People say, oh, it's just made up. It's just a fairy tale. It's a bit of poetic fluff. But that completely misunderstands how ancient literature operates. In the ancient world, symbolic language was considered more true, more profound than mere historical journalism. It was a way of structuring reality to show the deeper meaning behind human suffering and historical upheaval. And if you want a clue as to why the human mind naturally gravitated towards the number 40 to represent a time of painful, agonizing preparation before a new reality is born, you don't actually have to look at Near Eastern theology. You just have to look at human biology. Think about it. From the moment of conception, when two cells fuse together in the dark, to the exact moment a fully formed, breathing human life enters this world, human gestation takes, on average, 280 days. And how many weeks is that? 40. The ancients may not have had ultrasound machines or modern embryology, but they were astute observers of the natural world and human anatomy. They kept track of time. They calculated the cycles of the moon and the rhythms of the human body. They noticed this profound biological reality. It takes 40 weeks of hidden development, 40 weeks of stretching and physical discomfort, 40 weeks of internal transition for a woman to bring forth a child. 40 is the precise amount of time it takes for a human being to be incubated and birthed. When the biblical writers applied this biological number to the grand scale of history, they were doing something incredibly sophisticated. They were using the universal human experience of pregnancy and labour pains as a metaphor for the collective experiences of their nation. They were telling their audience that when a community enters a 40 period, whether it is 40 days of rain, 40 days on a mountain, or 40 years in a desert, they are inside an historical womb. It is dark, it is uncomfortable, and it feels like a crisis. But labour pains are not meaningless. They are the necessary preparations required to birth an entirely new phase of human history, a new covenant, or a radically transformed identity. So today we are going to peel back the layers of this ancient biological and theological code. We are going back to the very beginning, to the primal waters of Genesis, to see how the number 40 was used to describe the unmaking and remaking of the world. Then we will climb Mount Sinai with Moses to understand the incubation of the law. From there we will travel to the devastating reality of 6th century BCE Babylonian exile to see how a traumatized, displaced people used 40 years to completely reinvent who they were. And finally, we will fast forward to 1st century Roman Empire to see how early Christian writers used a 40-day desert fast as a brilliant, provocative, political and theological statement against the religious establishment of their day. Grab your headphones, leave your modern watches at the door, and let's look at the B side of the number 40. To understand how this code functions in the text, we have to start at the very beginning of biblical literature, in the book of Genesis. Specifically, we need to look at the narrative of Noah and the Great Flood. Now, if you ask most people about the story of Noah's Ark, they picture a brightly coloured children's toy filled with smiling giraffes and elephants. But if you read the socio-historical reality of why this text was written and how its original audience understood it, it is actually a deeply dark cosmic horror story about the decreation of the universe. To understand why the text specifies that rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights, we first have to understand ancient Near East cosmology. The ancient Israelites, along with their Babylonian and Canaanite neighbours, did not view the world as a blue marble floating in empty space. They envisaged the universe as a flat disk of land anchored over a vast subterranean ocean called the Deep, or Tehom in Hebrew. Above the earth was a solid dome-like vault called the firmament, which held back a massive celestial ocean above the sky. This is something that I have discussed in a previous podcast, if you'd like to go back and have a look. In this worldview, creation was an act of divine containment. God had pushed back the chaotic waters above and the chaotic waters below to create a safe, dry, breathable space for humanity to exist. Order was carved out of chaos. But by Genesis chapter 6, human violence, corruption, and systemic injustice have corrupted that space entirely. The text says the earth was filled with chamas, the Hebrew word for structural violence and wrongdoing. Humanity has systematically ruined the good creation, and so God decides to hit the cosmic reset button. And how does he do it? Genesis 7:11 tells us that the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the windows of the heavens were opened. God doesn't just send a big thunderstorm, he literally steps back and allows the chaotic oceans above the sky and beneath the earth to collapse back into the middle. The boundaries of creation are dissolved. The universe is being systematically unmade, returned to the primordial, formless, watery chaos that existed before Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. And the text explicitly states that this collapse, this pouring in of cosmic chaos, lasts for 40 days and 40 nights. Now, why 40? Why didn't the writers write 10 days, 100 days, or a year? Because to the ancient listener, 40 days signalled that this was the definite period of cosmic incubation. The old, violent, corrupted world was being dissolved into a giant global womb of water. The earth was being submerged back into the embryonic fluid of chaos. For 40 days, the ark floats on the surface of this cosmic womb. It is a period of total suspension. Everything that once defined human civilization, the cities, the empires, the power structures, the violence, is completely gone, erased from the ledger. Noah and his family are suspended in time, waiting for a birth. And when the 40 days end, the waters begin to recede. Dry land emerges, and Noah steps out onto a remade earth as a new Adam, given the exact same command that Adam was given, to be fruitful, multiply, and to fill the earth. The 40 days of the flood were the mandatory labour pains required to purge the earth of its structural violence and bring forward a new slate. It was biology applied to the cosmos. But the Code of 40 doesn't just operate on a cosmic level. It also operates on a political and national level, and for that, we have to look at the figure of Moses. Think of the book of Exodus. The Israelites have been delivered from Egypt. They have crossed the Red Sea. They are camped at the base of Mount Sinai. The mountain is wrapped in smoke and fire because Yahweh has descended upon it. Moses is called up into the clouds to meet with God and receive the blueprints for a completely new society, the Torah. Exodus chapter 24, verse 18 tells us that Moses entered the cloud and went up on the mountain, and he was on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. Now let's look at the socio-historical context at this moment. The people sitting at the bottom of the mountain are a mess. They've just spent 400 years submerged in Egyptian culture, Egyptian religion, and Egyptian imperial politics. They are physically out of Egypt, but ideologically they are still entirely captive to the pharaonic system. They do not know how to be a free people. They do not know how to build a society based on justice and equity rather than slavery and exploitation. Moses' ascent into the mountain for 40 days is a literal and figurative incubation period. For 40 days, Moses is completely cut off from human society. He enters a liminal space, a threshold between heaven and earth. He is undergoing a radical personal transformation, fasting from the basic necessities of human survival so he can be filled with a completely new way of organising human life. But notice what happens at the bottom of the mountain while Moses is inside that 40-day womb. The people panic. 40 days is a long time to wait. It is a terrifyingly silent interval. Without the visible structure of a leader, the people revert right back to what they knew in Egypt. They gather their gold, they melt it down, and they build a golden calf, a classic symbol of Egyptian divine power and economic stability. And they say, this is the God that brought us out of Egypt. When Moses comes down the mountain after his 40 days carrying the stone tablets, he sees that the birth has gone horribly wrong. The people weren't ready. The old Egyptian mindset hadn't been purged. So what does Moses do? He smashes the tablets, destroys the calf, and then, in details most people forget, Exodus chapter 34:28 tells us he has to go back up the mountain for a second period of 40 days and 40 nights, once again fasting from bread and water to rewrite the covenant. Do you see the structural pattern? The number 40 always marks the space between the old reality and the new reality. It is the time of radical suspension where human ego, human impatience, and old cultural addictions are put into a crucible. If you try to cut the 40 days short, if you build a golden calf because you can't handle the silence of the incubation period, you ruin everything. This is the exact same lesson that the prophet Elijah had to learn centuries later. In 1 Kings 19, Elijah is completely burnt out. He's fought the prophets of Baal, he's being hunted by Queen Jezebel, and he throws himself under a bush, begging God to let him die. He said, "I've had enough, Lord. Take my life." But an angel wakes him up, bakes him some bread on hot stones, and gives him a jar of water. And the text says that Elijah arose, ate and drank, and he journeyed on the strength of that food for 40 days and 40 nights, until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God, which is just another name for Mount Sinai. Why 40 days? Because Elijah needed to retrace the steps of Moses. He needed to go back to the original womb of Israel's identity. His 40-day journey through the wilderness was a period of therapeutic deconstruction. God was stripping away Elijah's spiritual pride, his despair, and his political exhaustion, preparing him for the still small voice that would give him a completely new mission and a new perspective on history. The authors of these texts knew exactly what they were portraying. For Noah, for Moses, and for Elijah, 40 was the threshold of human possibility. It was the incubation period required to transition a human leader, or the entire cosmos, out of a corrupted past and into a divine future. But as we'll see in our next segment, when the entire nation of Israel found themselves stripped of their land and their temple, they had to face a 40 period that wasn't measured in days, but in decades. Imagine you are an elite Judean scribe, a royal historian, or a temple priest in the year 586 BCE. You have just watched your entire world collapse in a matter of weeks. Nebuchadnezzar's imperial Babylonian army has systematically breached the walls of Jerusalem. The temple, the glorious stone structure built by Solomon, the place you believed was the literal footstool of your God Yahweh, and therefore completely invincible, has been plundered, set on fire, and reduced to a pile of smoking rubble. The Davidic king, the direct descendant of David, whom God promised would always sit on the throne, has been captured, forced to watch his sons executed, then blinded and dragged away in bronze chains. And you, along with the entire educated class, the artisans, the leaders, and the intellectuals, have been forcibly marched across hundreds of kilometres of hostile desert, displaced from your homeland and resettled as refugees by the canals of Babylon. It is almost impossible for us to overstate the psychological and theological trauma of this moment. In the ancient Near East, warfare was not just a battle between human armies. It was a cosmic battle between rival deities. If your city was destroyed, your temple burned, it meant your god had lost a fight with the enemy god. It meant Marduk, the storm god of Babylon, was officially stronger, more capable, and more real than Yahweh, the God of Israel. The Judeans were sitting by the waters of Babylon, weeping, asking the most terrifying question a community can ask. Who are we now? Are we still Yahweh's people if we don't have his land, his city, or his temple? Has he abandoned us forever? Did the covenant fail? Or worse, is our God just a weak, defeated local deity? It is precisely during this profound dark night of the soul, this Babylonian exile, that the disparate oral traditions, the ancient songs, legal codes, and historical chronicles of Israel were gathered up, thoroughly edited, reinterpreted, and stitched together into a cohesive library. This is the moment when the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and the large historical sweeping books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings were given their final shape by the priestly and Deuteronomistic editors. And this is where the brilliant subversive genius of the B-side comes to light. The scribes and priests sitting in Babylon did not use this editing process to rewrite history and make themselves look like a glorious, flawless empire. They didn't write propaganda to cover up their failures. Instead, they leaned heavily, intentionally, into a specific framing device from their ancient law, the 40-year wilderness wandering. Think about the sheer brilliance of this literary and pastoral strategy. If you are an exile living under the shadow of the massive ziggurats of Babylon, feeling completely hopeless, alienated, and identityless, and you read the newly compiled stories of your ancestors escaping Egypt under Moses, what do you notice? You notice that they also lost everything. You notice they were also homeless. They were stripped of safety, trapped in a terrifying, liminal, dangerous space between a traumatic past of slavery and an unfulfilled, uncertain future. And the text tells you they stayed in that wilderness for 40 years. Now let's look at this with an historical and geographical honesty. If you look at a map of Egypt and Israel, walking from the Nile Delta across the Sinai Peninsula to Jerusalem does not take 40 years. It doesn't even take 40 weeks. It takes a few weeks at most, even if you are moving a large group of people with livestock and children. Geographically, it's a relatively short trek. But the text of Numbers chapter 14 gives us the explicit socio-historical reason for the massive delay. When the Israelites reached the edge of the Promised Land, they sent in 12 spies to scout it out. 10 of those spies came back with a terrifying report, panicking the community, saying the cities were too fortified and the people were like giants. The community wept, rebelled against Moses, and explicitly demanded to elect a new leader to take them back to Egypt. They preferred the predictable security of their chains to the terrifying responsibility of freedom. And so, Yahweh delivers a devastating decree in Numbers chapter 14, verse 33. He declares, "Your children shall be shepherds in the wilderness for 40 years, and shall suffer for your faithlessness until your last corpses fall in the wilderness." To an ancient Near Eastern mind, 40 years were not just an arbitrary number plucked out of thin air to mean a long time. It was the standard, universally recognised linguistic idiom for a complete biological generation. It was the average lifespan of an adult in the ancient world from the time they reached maturity and had children to the time they died. By framing their history this way, the exiles in Babylon were telling themselves a brutal, clinical, yet deeply comforting psychological truth. It takes 40 years for an old, toxic mindset to die. Think about the raw psychological reality of that wilderness generation. The people who came out of Egypt were physically liberated by the plagues and the splitting of the sea, but mentally, emotionally, and structurally, they were still thoroughly enslaved. At the very first sign of thirst, hunger, or uncertainty, they cried out to go back to the imperial meat pots of Egypt. They were psychologically institutionalized. They had a slave mentality, addicted to hierarchy, dependent on masters, and completely lacking the internal resilience, mutual trust, and faith required to build a free, just, egalitarian society. The scribes in Babylon realized you cannot build a free, sovereign nation out of people who still carry the internal programming of an empire. So, the 40 years in the wilderness was recontextualized by the exiles not merely as an arbitrary prison sentence from an angry God, but as a necessary therapeutic cultural incubator. It was the precise amount of time required for the slave generation to naturally pass away and for an entirely new generation, born in the vacuum of freedom, forged in the harsh, equalizing realities of the desert, dependent on the daily manna rather than the imperial handout, to rise up and take their place. By editing the Torah through this specific lens, the exiles in Babylon were able to look at their own current crisis and realize something completely revolutionary. They realized that their current exile in Babylon was not the final catastrophic end of their story. It wasn't a sign that Marduk had won. It was simply their own modern 40-year wilderness. It was another cosmic reset button. It was the painful, agonizing, necessary labour period required to burn away their corporate corruptions, their addictions to bad kings, and their neglect of the poor, so that a spiritually renewed, tech-centered community could finally be birthed to return to the land. But this ancient code of 40 didn't stay buried in the archives of Babylon. 600 years later, a new movement would burst out of the very same Judean desert using this exact same 40-day and 40-year blueprint to launch a spiritual and political revolution under the iron fist of the Roman Empire. And that is where the code shifts from a tool of national survival to a weapon of theological warfare. So let's fast forward 600 years from the canals of Babylon. The Babylonian Empire is a distant, dusty memory in the history books. But for the people living in first century Judea, the socio-political reality remains frustratingly, tragically the same. They are once again an occupied, oppressed people, this time living under the iron boot and tax-extracting machinery of the Roman Empire. The air in first century Israel is thick with apocalyptic anxiety, deep economic resentment, and the intense religious fragmentation. If you walk through the streets of Jerusalem, you can feel the tension. You've got the aristocratic Sadducees collaborating directly with Roman governors like Pontius Pilate to maintain their wealth and power in the temple. You've got the Pharisees trying to micromanage every detail of ritual purity to force God's hand. You've got the zealots sharpening their daggers in dark alleys, waiting to launch a bloody guerrilla war against Roman legions. And you've got the Essenes, who have completely given up on society, retreating to the desolate caves of Qumran, convinced that the entire world is corrupt and that a cosmic battle between the sons of light and sons of darkness is imminent. Everyone is asking the exact same question their ancestors asked in Babylon. When is Yahweh going to act? When is the new Moses going to arrive and lead us on a second ultimate exodus out of imperial oppression? Where is our deliverance? It is into this violent political powder keg, this historical pressure cooker, that a young carpenter turned rabbi, named Jesus of Nazareth, steps onto the scene. And when the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark and Luke, sit down decades later to compile his story and write his biographies, they do something absolutely brilliant. They don't just write a dry journalistic record of the man's life. They engage in a masterclass of ancient theological branding and political polemic. They use that literary technique we mentioned earlier called typology. They deliberately frame Jesus' actions, his words, and his movement so they perfectly mirror the old sacred stories of the Torah. They are signalling to a highly saturated, scripturally literate first-century Jewish audience that the ancient story is finally reaching its climax. And what is the primary literary code they use to trigger that realization? It is, of course, the number 40. In the Synoptic Gospels, immediately after Jesus is baptized by John in the Jordan River, where the heavens open and a divine voice identifies him as the beloved Son, the text says the Holy Spirit immediately drives him straight out into the barren, rocky Judean desert. And there he stays, completely alone, fasting from food, facing the psychological and spiritual temptations of the devil for exactly 40 days. To a modern Western Christian reader, 40 days of fasting just sounds like a remarkable, almost superhuman feat of physical endurance and personal piety. It's treated like a spiritual discipline or devotional example. But to a first-century Jewish listener, the historical and theological alarm bells would have been ringing instantly. They wouldn't have been marvelling at his calorie deficiency. They would have been connecting the historical dots. A divine leader standing in the wilderness, facing a crisis of identity for 40 days. This is a direct, undeniable, high-definition echo of Israel's 40 years in the wilderness and Moses' 40 days in the fiery summit of Sinai. And this is where the B-side analysis gets truly fascinating. The Gospel writers are not just comparing Jesus to Israel, they are setting up a historical mirror match. They are casting Jesus to step into the historical arena and literally reenact Israel's greatest corporate failure, but with one radical, revolutionary twist. Think back to the original 40-year wilderness wandering we unpacked in the last segment. How did corporate Israel do when they were put to the desert crucible? They failed almost every single test. They crumbled under pressure. The text of Exodus and Numbers is a long, repetitive ledger of complaining, rebellion, and failure. Now, look at the specific anatomy of Jesus' temptation in the desert through the eyes of that first century audience, and watch how the Gospel writers constructed this typological duel. First, after 40 days of starvation, the devil approaches Jesus and attacks him at his weakest physical point. He says, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." It is the ultimate temptation of immediate physical gratification and convenience. It is the temptation to use divine power to bypass human suffering. But how do the writers have Jesus respond? He doesn't invent a new theological argument. He fires back by quoting Scripture. Specifically, he quotes Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3, a verse written explicitly about the 40-year wilderness wandering, reminding the people that Yahweh let them go hungry in the desert to teach them that humans do not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes out of the mouth of God. Jesus placed himself directly in the wilderness narrative, but where Israel grumbled for food and failed, Jesus trusts and triumphs. Next, the devil takes him up to a high place, shows him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time, and offers him instant, total political and military sovereignty over the earth, if Jesus will just bow down and worship him. It is the temptation of the shortcut. It is the temptation to achieve good ends through corrupt imperial means. It is the ultimate golden calf. It's exactly what Israel did at the foot of Sinai when they built a god they could control because Moses was gone for 40 days. But Jesus counters with Deuteronomy yet again, this time quoting chapter 6, verse 13. "Worship the Lord your God and serve only him." So where Israel bowed to the calf of economic and political security, Jesus remains unyielding. And finally, the devil takes him to the highest pinnacle of the Jerusalem temple and tells him to throw himself off, quoting a psalm saying that angels will catch him. The devil is tempting him to stage a spectacular, undeniable public miracle to force God's hand and shock the masses into submission. It is the temptation of spiritual arrogance and presumption. And Jesus fires back with his final arrow from the book of Deuteronomy, quoting chapter 6, verse 16. "Do not put the Lord your God to the test." Now, what is the original context of that verse? Moses wrote that to rebuke the Israelites because they put God to the test at a place called Massa, where they angrily demanded water and said, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Do you see the incredible socio-historical and theological weight of what the gospel writers are doing here? By framing this entire encounter around the precise code of 40 days, they are making a massive, provocative, and highly subversive claim to a fractured first century world. They are telling their audience, look at this man. Corporate Israel spent 40 years in the desert, and under the pressure of empire and hunger, they failed. But this new leader spent 40 days in the desert under the exact same pressure, and he won. Jesus is being systematically cast as the new Israel and the new Moses wrapped into one. He is doing what the nation could never do for itself. He is absorbing the old historical narratives of exile, trauma, and failure, and he is rewriting the script into a narrative of absolute victory. For a first century audience looking for a militaristic Messiah to violently overthrow the Roman legions, this 40-day story was a profound, jarring critique. It was a declaration that true liberation from oppression does not start with a military rebellion or with temple politics. It starts with a radical internal deconstruction of the ego and imperial programming forged in the silent fires of testing. The gospel writers were telling their audience that if they wanted to escape the current Roman exile, they had to follow this new leader into the 40-day incubator to be completely reborn. So when we strip away the centuries of theological varnish and pull back on the layers of this ancient number, what are we actually looking at? We are looking at a brilliant, highly standardized piece of ancient Near East literary shorthand. From the global reset button of Noah's flood, to Moses surviving on a mountaintop without snacks, to the exiles rebranding their national trauma in Babylon, and finally to the gospel writers engaging in a first century marketing war under the nose of Roman legions, the number 40 was never about a digital stopwatch. It was the ancient world's ultimate shorthand for buckle up, everything is about to change. It is the literary equivalent of a filmmaker using 3 years later, or a novelist starting a chapter with a dark and stormy night. The moment an ancient listener heard the number 40, they knew exactly what genre of story they were in. They didn't pull out a calculator, they pulled out their seatbelts because they knew a massive cultural or political transition was hitting the script. Understanding this doesn't just clear up a biblical quirk, it completely changes how we read these ancient texts. It stops us from treating ancient Near East scribes like 21st century's accountants who can't keep track of time, and starts letting us appreciate them for what they actually were. Incredibly sophisticated storytellers, master propagandists, and sharp political survivalists who knew exactly how to code their literature to keep their culture alive. That brings today's episode to an end. Next time on the B-Side Bible, we are stepping away from numbers and stepping into the strange, bizarre world of ancient performing art. If you picture a biblical prophet, you probably think of a dignified, bearded man standing on a hill, calmly handing out moral advice. But if you look at the historical data, the reality is far more wild. In the ancient Near East, prophets weren't polite preachers. They were radical, countercultural street performers who used extreme shock value to bypass the political filters of their days. We're talking about Ezekiel, a man who built a toy city out of mud bricks, lay on his side for over a year, and bargained with God over whether he had to cook his dinner over human feces. We'll look at Isaiah, an elite royal advisor who staged a 3-year-long naked protest through the streets of Jerusalem to stop a military treaty. We'll unpack Hosea's highly public chaotic marriage, and we'll figure out why a bald prophet named Elisha ended up in a brutal showdown with a teenage street gang and 2 female bears. We are stripping away the Sunday school varnish and looking at these figures for what they actually were. Media-savvy political saboteurs who are willing to lose their hair, their clothes and their minds just to break through that cultural noise. That's next time on the B-Side Bible. Catch you on the flip side.